want to share with you today from the book of Romans as well as 2 Corinthians chapter 10. We live in a world today where we're bombarded with media, information, technology, and as I listened to a devotional just this morning as well, it reminded me that God never intended us to be bombarded with so much. And for most of us, that means turning off our phone or at least silencing it for a while. Maybe not ingesting so much news, whatever it is. But, the psalmist told us, be still and know that I am God. And as the devotional that I listened to was, the challenge was the roar of the world causes the voice of God to be silenced. And whether that roar is in our phone and media and television or music, or sometimes it's just in our head. We allow too much to go on inside the walls of our mind, and we lose sight of the purpose and the plan that God has. And so I want to spend this week talking about our thinking and what it is we can do, because Romans 12, you're familiar with the passage, but let me read this to you. Paul says to the church at Rome, and they had their own set of issues. They were living in a difficult day, much like what we live in. And it was a different time, a different scenario, a different situation. But Paul is addressing the issue. And notice what he says. I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present yourselves a living sacrifice. So he's saying present your body, your physical body, as a living sacrifice. How? Holy, acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service. And then here's the clincher. And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. So that, when you renew your mind, here's what happens. So that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. I think Paul's so clear in what he is trying to help us understand, that if we want the will of God, if we want to please the Lord, it begins in our mind, in our thinking. And so I jotted down a few things. Here's the problem. One, I'm born with a sin nature, right? We know Romans 3:23, for all have sinned. We're born with a sin nature. The second part of this, from 1 John chapter 2, and there's a lot right there in 15, 16, 17. But my flesh, that sinful nature flesh that I carry about with me, it is constantly wanting to be number one. It wants to be satisfied. It wants to be recognized. It wants to be the purpose for which everything I do, and sometimes even what I should not do but want to do, that's where my flesh comes in. And then ultimately, as Proverbs 23:7 says, as a man thinketh in his heart, so is he. My actions are a result of my thinking. And so let's go over to 2 Corinthians chapter 10 and see what here again Paul is writing. And I already mentioned, the church at Rome had their own set of issues. The church at Corinth had a whole lot of issues as well. And if you're familiar with Paul's rebuke in 1 Corinthians and then the resolve that comes in 2 Corinthians, but they were dealing with a lot of issues in their church. But notice in chapter 10, beginning in verse 3, how he resolves, what he says. Here's the solution to many of the things that you're dealing with. For though we walk in the flesh, so we're living in this fleshly body, much like what we just said from Romans chapter 12. For though we walk in the flesh, we do not war against the flesh. The problem isn't person to person. It's not really my flesh. What's he say? For the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty in God for pulling down of strongholds, casting down arguments and every high thing that exalts itself against God, bringing into every thought into captivity to the obedience of Christ. There it is. Just like Romans 12, be transformed through the renewing of your mind, Now he says in 2 Corinthians chapter 10, he says, bring every thought into captivity. So here's the thing. We battle with our thinking, right? You see a billboard on the freeway, boom, there it is. It makes you think something. We hear a song from our past, boom, there it is. Our thinking goes off. Someone says something that pushes a button, boom, there it is. Our thinking is in control. But what does he say? He tells you to bring into captivity. Stop the thinking right in its tracks. Don't let the process of the mind continue in a downward spiral. And so the key to this, of understanding where I am, what I'm going through, the battle that I'm in, comes back to understanding my thinking. And so let me give you just some principles here that will go and kind of lead us into where we want to be on Wednesday. But here's the problem with changing my thinking. First, my battles are not primarily physical battles. Sure, we have a flesh. We have a problem with our flesh. Sometimes we have, things that are going on, and maybe it's another person. But let's go beyond the thinking that the problem is my flesh or someone else's flesh. It's a spiritual battle. The enemy, Satan himself, is going to attack you through your thinking, through your emotions. He is going to use those things that are non-physical to bring about temptation, struggles, anger, all the things that we battle with, and he's going to do that. Because what's he say? He says in that passage, although we walk in the flesh, the sarxis is really what he's referring to, the human nature, our battle is somewhere else, and it's a spiritual battle. Then he says in verse 4, for the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty through God. Those weapons that God has made available are they're not just sitting on the top shelf, right? There needs to be a heart and a passion and a seeking and a waiting for God to bring about the weapons that we need. And so, our weapons are literally the tools of defense, the instruments that we use to overcome the enemy. They're not physical, fleshly, carnal, he says. They're mighty through God. And I love this word. It's dunamis. You and I get the English word dynamite. So the weapons that we truly have available to us are dynamite type power to pull down strongholds. And it literally in the Greek language means to destroy or to demolish. I like that because why? We get frustrated at the flesh and the temptation and the devil. And I don't want to just literally just knock them off. I don't want to just tip them over. I don't want to just have a little bit of victory. I want total, complete, powerful God victory. And that's exactly what he promises to us if we do that. But we notice he goes on in verse 5 and verse 6, casting down arguments and bringing every thought into captivity. One Greek lexicon says it this way: the arguments and the reasonings by which a disputant endeavors to fortify his opinion and defend it against his opponent. This is like the court of law, and two lawyers are going at it, and they're throwing everything that they have in order to win their case. That's what these arguments and strongholds that are within our flesh are trying to do to defeat us. And God says, hey, wait a minute. I have the power. I have the tool. You trust me. You wait on me. You pray about this, and I will provide and I will give them to you. And when he says this in verse 4, 5, and 6 about these arguments, it's literally the word we get logic from. Isn't it funny how some people, when they argue their point, it's all logic. It's illogical. It's the nature of how they do it. Some people use threatening things. Some people use anger. Some people raise their voice, right? There's all these different methods. And what the enemy and our flesh is trying to do is to make you think logically that you deserve or that you need this. John MacArthur, pastor, said the ideological forts in which men barricade themselves against God. These reasonings, these the word logic, the logical arguments. We barricade ourselves against God. But here's the thing. You and I must make it personal. It must come down to the point where it's, you know what, God? I don't want to live this way any longer. I'm sick and tired of the defeat. I'm tired of the temptation. I'm tired of the way my mind thinks. Those neurotransmitters that God wired within our brain that create these ruts of thinking. And over and over again, we have negative thinking. And God's saying, wait a minute, bring these thoughts into captivity. Be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And where do we get the source of help for that? It's God's Word. Immersing ourselves, dwelling upon the Word, reading the Word, listening to the Word, committing ourselves to the Word over and over and over. And by gentle, step by step, our transformation of our mind will take place because we're now filling it with God's Word. And so let me encourage you this week. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, even though you're only going to hear from me on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, make a commitment that within yourself, you're going to do more this week to read God's Word, to think about God's Word, and to begin the process of transforming your mind through the power that God has made available. Have a great Monday.